Speaker is Dr. Carolyn Manhart. Dr. Manhart is a first-generation Korean American whose parents were children during the Korean War. Despite the utter destruction of the country by the war, her parents, along with her fellow countrymen, are deeply grateful to the American soldiers who saved their homeland from communism. Carolyn has the privilege of accompanying the Korean War veterans to Washington, D.C. on the October 2014 honor flight as the physician guardian. Meeting the men who risked their lives in wretched conditions for the freedom of our own parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins was a life-changing experience. It is my honor to welcome Dr. Manhart to the podium.
Good evening. My name is Carolyn Chey Manhart. I was born in Los Angeles and raised in Fullerton, California by my mom and dad, who were refugee children in the Korean War. In October of 2013, Erin Grace of the Omaha World Herald wrote a story about the first Korean War honor flight, featuring my parents and me. As a second-generation Korean American, I would accompany the Korean War veterans to D.C. as a physician guardian, with the opportunity to say thank you for saving South Korea from the evils of communism. In preparation for Erin's interview, I asked my parents to share their war experience with me. As an 11-year-old boy, my dad was going to school in Seoul with some of his siblings while being cared for by his grandmother. He vividly remembers people running out of their homes into the streets, shouting, "War, war, war!" It was 4 a.m. on Sunday morning, June 25th, 1950, when tanks manned by thousands of North Korean soldiers crossed over the 38th parallel to take the capital city of Seoul. His family home was in the small town of Munsan, just south of the 38th parallel. Dad walked 25 miles back home to Munsan when the war broke. Dead bodies were lying on the rice fields along the way. Cars, trucks, and bridges were burned on the side of the road. One night, his aunt and uncle's house in Munsan was bombed by the United Nations. The UN was trying to destroy the supply chain of the North Korean army, which would transport ammunition at night. My dad's aunt and baby cousin died in that bombing. My dad also remembers the North Koreans teaching their songs in his school to brainwash the children. My mom, 7 years old at the time, remembers the North Koreans capturing priests and nuns and treating them like animals, dragging them into a line and taking them to North Korea. If they were weak and unable to walk, they would be killed. My mother's father, my grandfather, was captured by the North Koreans while he was delivering food to Catholic nuns, never to be seen again. After the second invasion on January 4th, when the Chinese soldiers joined the North Koreans and pushed the South Koreans and the UN forces south once again, Mom's family fled south on foot in the snow to a small mountain village. After the recapture of Seoul, my mom remembers returning and seeing the ashes of the burned down house and her mom's treasured dishes that had all melted together. They continued to use these melted dishes to eat food provided by Catholic Relief Services. After their family lived in a single dorm room at a school for 6 months, they moved to a different building for refugees with no windows. The physical devastation of the Korean peninsula and civilian and military casualties were immense. But what would have happened if the U.S. and the UN had not defended South Korea? Yeonmi Park, a North Korean refugee who today speaks out against the tyranny of the North Korean dictatorship, clearly lays out the brainwashing and human rights violations suffered by the North Koreans. They are being starved, their thoughts and speech are censored, and they are forbidden to practice religion. Any questioning of their almighty dictator, Kim Jong-un, results in incarceration in prison camps to face forced labor, torture, and the likelihood of death from starvation or execution. This would have been the fate of South Koreans had the U.S. not entered the war. On the first Korean War honor flight, I met a veteran named Myron Schiffelbein from Lincoln, Nebraska. He fought in Moonson, the very town where my father was raised. This was my God-given opportunity to thank Myron for his sacrifices as I pushed his wheelchair around the memorials that day in Washington, D.C. About 6 weeks after the flight, I mailed Myron photos that I had taken of him that day. I received a letter from his daughter Nancy about 3 months later. Myron had indeed received the photos and had looked them over again and again that night. The timing was God's timing, as Myron had a large stroke the very next day and died 2 weeks later. Myron had previously asked his daughter if she could send me some copies of his old Korea photos, and she fulfilled his request. The Korean children in Myron's black and white photos reminded me of a photo I'd seen of my dad when he was a young boy, skinny, with shiny eyes and a serious expression. In her letter, Nancy Schiffelbein wrote, "Even though my dad was 26 years old, he looks like a kid. It was such a small window of his life, but changed everything about him from that time on." I had bought a book called Battle for Korea from Borders bookstore prior to the honor flight and passed it around the plane during the flight home. On the cover was a sticky note from me that read, "Dear Korean War veterans, would you please sign your name, hometown, and where you were in the war on the inside of this book for me? Thank you for your service. Love, Korean American Carolyn Manhart." Now I have this beautiful keepsake with the handwritten signatures of many Nebraskan soldiers who fought in bitterly cold conditions in an unknown country to defend a defenseless people from communist invaders. The sacrifice of these young soldiers resulted in the end of combat, freedom, and the rebirth of the economy. Samsung technology, LG televisions, and Hyundai and Kia automobiles exist today because the U.S. and the UN did not permit the North Koreans to trample upon their weaker neighbor by way of military aggression. Finally, the sacrifice of the Korean War veterans made it possible for many to emigrate to the U.S. to begin again. My parents and relatives and many Koreans here today are among the blessed. One generation later, it seems almost miraculous that here I am, a physician in Nebraska, to serve this community because of the sacrifices of the Korean War veterans. My parents wanted me to tell you, all Koreans thank the U.S. and the Korean War veterans for their sacrifices. In the Gospel of John, as the pastor said, Jesus says no one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. To Korean War veterans and to all veterans and your families, thank you for laying down your lives. You know better than anyone that freedom is not free.